Welcome to the Reversion Podcast, everyone. I'm your host, Anthony of Westgate, and I'm joined by a special guest today. He's a former member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which we all know as the Mormon Church, who has recently converted to Orthodox Christianity, thank God. And his name is Drew. I'm very excited for this discussion with him. It's going to be taking some wild twists and turns as we explore the dark occult history of Mormonism, its founders, and some of the more bizarre doctrines. And we'll learn more about Drew's conversion experience into the true Church of Christ, the Orthodox Church. So welcome, Drew, and thank you for taking the time to join me here. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, Anthony.
So why don't we start off with you just telling a little bit of your story and how you ended up converting to Orthodoxy, as much as you feel comfortable telling us.
Sure. Yeah, so I grew up in Southern California, Los Angeles area. Grew up in a big Mormon family. There's 6 kids. Pretty good childhood. I had, a lot of good family friends, good church community within the Mormon church. Good parents, good relationships with my siblings. Pretty normal childhood. Got really into sports. Most of my friends actually were not Mormon, just because there wasn't a huge population of Mormons where I grew up. But when I did go to church, there's a good community waiting for me there. I did have ancestry in the Mormon church, which is interesting. So basically, my great-great-grandfather or something was in the first graduating class of Brigham Young Academy, which is now Brigham Young University. So I have ancestors who go back to the pioneers, and I have ancestors who knew Joseph Smith personally. So that's on one side of my family, as far as just the roots going deep in Mormonism. And most young men in Mormonism at the age of 19, I did what's called a mission. So I went from Southern California, I moved to Ohio for 2 years. And I was, one of those goofy-looking Mormon missionaries who has a white shirt and tie and bike helmet, and just walked around talking to mostly Protestants all day about how they should join the true church, the Mormon church. So got into a lot of minor debates, you could say, but that's probably what kindled, my interest in the Bible and again, more novice level apologetics, or at least just looking into things more deeply when it comes to truth claims of different forms of Christianity. And so, after doing my mission, went to college, met my wife after college in the Mormon church, which the Mormon church is really nice because they do have whole congregations of young single adults who are looking to get married. So that's how I was able to, meet my wife. And then the two of us actually did get married in the Mormon temple. Flash forward, what would it be now? 8 years that I've been married. And the last few years of our marriage was when, things started to get a little crazy in the world, as I'm sure all of us remember. And, the unfortunate incidents of 2019, 2020. That's when I started doing some real soul searching and researching, which we can get a little more into. But that's just kind of a little bit of a background on me.
There was such a strong spiritual shift that happened during that time, during the meme virus. I meet so many Orthodox converts that converted during that time, myself included. So it's just so interesting, to hear kind of the far reaches of the spectrum of people that ended up having these spiritual awakenings during that time. So was there anything in particular during that time that prompted this search?
Yeah, I would say it was a perfect storm of different things going on in my life. So some things were a little more on the personal level, me being married, starting to have more kids. Right now I have 4 kids, but when I started looking at Orthodoxy, I had 2 pretty young sons. And when you have sons, there is a feeling of I want to raise them in a church that is going to be the same when they're my age. So, there's some feeling of wanting to, pass the legacy of faith to your children that's unchanging as much as, practically possible. So that's happening where I'm building a family and I'm wanting to plant that family's roots deep into, the true faith, which at the time, I believed was Mormonism. And then of course there's, the meme virus, which was happening. And
Yeah.
within the Mormon church, everything was shut down, no questions asked for many months. Like all churches, all temples shut down. Immediately, like as soon as the siren was sounded by all the elites, it's like, okay, let's shut everything down. Which was not the case in many other churches. I mean, some other churches made weird, accommodations to this nonsense, but in Mormon church, it's like you stay home and you do church in your living room. And that was just a very odd thing to hear because when I was a Mormon missionary and I was mostly talking to Protestants, the main thrust of the arguments that I had with Protestants was like, not even arguments, just disagreements, was, hey, why do I need to go to your church and, take part in sacred, we call them ordinances, Orthodox would know them as sacraments. It would say, why do I need to do all that when I can just sit at home and read my Bible and get close to Jesus that way? And as a Mormon, I'd always tell them, well, the apostles, they established a church, they established people to act in the name of God in order to carry out these holy ordinances, is what we call them, or sacraments that are necessary for your salvation. So yes, you do need to go to church. You do need to be part of the body of Christ. So pretty similar arguments, major differences there, but pretty similar arguments to what an Orthodox would make to a Protestant. I spent 2 years, having those kind of discussions, and then the Mormon hierarchy then tells me, well, that's no longer the case. You don't need to go to church. You could just do church in your living room. So that was just very odd because 2 reasons. It just was a total shift in emphasis on what really matters most. And 2, it was just so disheartening to see my church bend the knee so easily to the powers that be, because I had a basic knowledge of early Christian history to know that the early Christians were worshiping in secret in the catacombs. They were martyred all over the place for doing so. And there was just such courage there in the early Christian church that I started to ask myself, well, how can we Mormons call ourselves the true Christian church if we don't have that same kind of faith that the early Christians had to keep worshiping no matter what kind of oppression we were facing from the powers that be? And then there was the whole Mormon leadership telling people to get vaccinated. The words "be a good global citizen" were repeated by the president and prophet of the Mormon church, which is just a very creepy phrase to hear. And everyone had to mask up and, use your hand sanitizer every 5 seconds like a psychotic. So me and my wife and our children were the only ones who would go to church and not mask up because we just wanted to show people no, we're not going to live in fear. This is absolutely ridiculous. And so, yeah, it was just a lot of feeling that pressure. I was on an island, just me and my wife, and we were surrounded by people who were being so massively psyoped, and there was nothing that they were grasping onto when it came to their faith. It was more just grasping on to the narrative that was being, spoon-fed to them. And again, that's not to judge people because people deal with trauma, mass trauma differently, but it does make you really go in deep inside yourself and what do I actually believe here and what's real?
Yeah.
I watch people's actions. I don't just listen to their words.
I think that attributed to a lot of these, I guess, conversions and spiritual awakenings, whatever you want to call it. People were kind of just really confronted with how serious they take their values. And it was a lot of inner searching at that time. So were you aware of how centralized the authority was in the LDS church, that they could just, from the top down implement a new policy that all the LDS churches across America have to follow this policy?
Yeah, that was also an eye-opening thing for me because I always took it for granted that, my congregation and my area, my little area of Mormonism could kind of have some kind of autonomy when it comes to, basically making the call according to local conditions. For example, I'm in the state of Arizona, so there wasn't any kind of massive lockdowns by the government here. But again, it's such a top-heavy church I mean, similar to Catholicism, that whatever comes down from the top is what everybody has to get in line with, lockstep immediately.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was also eye-opening to me, because I was like, wait a second, like, if there's, ideological capture or just serious, like, compromise at the top of this, massive organization worth hundreds of billions of dollars, I mean, that's just a little unnerving, because now something like what happened in 2019 continues to get worse, or just similar things keep happening, then we're going to all be moving towards something just extremely sinister, because it's not any kind of like principle that we're standing on here.
So I'm also curious about how much church history did they teach in the LDS Church? You said you were aware of the early Christians and how they were martyred. It seems like there's some obvious kind of allusion to there being something of an apostolic succession that they're obviously LARPing. Like, what are you taught about that they're kind of like establishing this, the way that they establish their authority and connection with the early church?
Yeah, and when I was a Mormon missionary, and this didn't get much better after my mission, because after my mission, I was, for a while there just reading Mormon literature that was reinforcing, my preconceived notions when it came to early Christianity. I had a very, very like low tier knowledge / arguments when it came to why we're the true church and why we can claim to be the early Christian church. It was pretty much along the lines of, hey, you had Jesus who came, you had him calling his apostles, he gave them authority to act in his name, which so far that's sounding pretty orthodox. But then it just falls off the cliff, because it's, we would tell everybody that we were talking to, as soon as the apostles died, I mean, boom, like there goes the church. Which is just kind of a weird argument, because if you go and actually read the New Testament, there's so many promises made that, the gates of hell would not prevail against the church, that the Holy Spirit would lead them into all truth, and Christ would be with them to the end of the age. I mean, there's the parable of the wheat and the tares. So there's all these things in the New Testament that just completely go against that idea that there's just this complete cessation of divine authority for 1700 years or so. The only way we could get people to buy into this, and again, we weren't usually talking to people who were, really deeply looking into the details of history. So we just had to give them kind of Reader's Digest version of 1700 years of history within like a 5-minute spiel. And it was usually just a lot of finger pointing at like someone like St. Constantine, saying like, which is probably going to be similar actually to what Baptists or Jehovah's Witnesses would say. Oh, it's all Constantine's fault. As soon as he got a hold of, basically as soon as he hijacked, the church, there was this inappropriate mingling with paganism and Hellenism and, something along those lines that corrupted. And now we have all these things that Mormons would never do, like infant baptism was a big one. The real presence, like Mormons don't believe in that either. So they would use these things that aren't Mormon practices, and there's evidence that the early church fell away because the early church was Mormon, and then it started doing things that weren't Mormon practices. Then, of course, the Trinity is always brought up. Like, well, we don't believe in the Trinity, ergo, the fact that the Trinity was, proclaimed at the Council of Nicaea, that means that the church fell away, because, of course, they believed in, like, Mormon polytheism for the few hundred years before that. So it just is a lot of cherry picking. It's a lot of, like, begging the question. It's a lot of, like, well, we're just assuming Mormonism was the default version of Christianity, and as soon as we see, Christians veer from that, well, they're no longer Christian and they're no longer the true church, and God was angry, so he just basically pulled the rug out from under them and took away his authority. It's a very sloppy argument. There's lacking all nuance, detail, any kind of sources. It's really just trail of blood level of discourse that we were giving to people.
Poor St. Constantine. He's kind of the ultimate scapegoat of all these Christian heresies. They always pin it on like, oh, well, everything went south at the Council of Nicaea thanks to Constantine, like whatever they say, paganizing the religion or something. So it sounds very familiar to what kind of most Protestants say when you ask them about their connection with the early church and what happened during that 1500-year span. There was kind of this idea that there was a great apostasy that took place that is somewhat arbitrary at some point in time, usually involving the first century or the first generation of apostles, and then all these wrong teachings got passed down, and then it's ultimately and Mormonism is included here, but it's ultimately kind of a technological religion because it depends on the invention of the printing press and the dissemination of books, of literature throughout the world, that then people can finally be enlightened. So far, it sounds like your standard kind of Christian heresy, but I think what we'll find in this conversation is that it's ultimately an occult religion. So, what I'm interested in, being kind of the theme of this podcast, of the content that I cover, is more of the kind of occult history of the founding of the Mormon Church and, Joseph Smith. Maybe you can just take us through, to the best of your knowledge, some of the history of how these doctrines emerged. Maybe we can start with the story of Joseph Smith, because I think we all know that as, there's this meme that we see often on discussion boards on Twitter and stuff about Mormonism being the white Islam, because there's all these parallels with Joseph Smith and the way that the revelation of the Book of Mormon came about from the angel Moroni. So why don't you tell us, a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I'll even try to tie it into, this whole idea of like the exoteric version of Mormonism versus more esoteric version of Mormonism. Because when I was a Mormon missionary, it was a very simple, almost modest proposition that I was making to people, which is just, hey, when we read the Bible, we can see that there was some kind of visible church, there was some kind of hierarchy, there was some kind of authority. So you don't have that in Protestantism, and you have nothing but divisions within Protestantism. So, yeah, Mormonism is true. It's the default, true religion because we have that authority. So it was like a very simplistic claim. But where it starts to fall apart really quickly is people would point out that Mormonism isn't just some like generic version of Christianity. In fact, most people wouldn't call it Protestantism because it just veers so heavily from things even the Protestants didn't like throw out. Like, for instance, the Trinity doctrine, or even like Martin Luther believed in the real presence. No one was claiming to be prophets and apostles who are in the Reformation. No one was coming out with new scripture. I mean, obviously Luther was, disputing with the canon of scripture, but again, it's just like Mormonism is almost like Protestantism on steroids, as far as like just going so off the rails that you can't even call it, to your point, you can't even really call it Christianity anymore. You can't call it Protestantism. It's just becoming like this whole new thing made of whole cloth that Joseph Smith, in his creative mind, was able to create. So that's where it would get kind of interesting, because if people were smart and I would give them that whole pitch on Mormonism, they'd say, well, wait a second, like the reformers are nothing like you, and neither are the church fathers. So like, where do your beliefs come from?
Yeah.
And that's really what you have to ask a Mormon, is you have to point out these things that have no business in even being associated with Christianity. And this is always the debate, is Mormons are like, we're Christians just like you. And they always get extremely offended when you say they're not Christians.
Yeah.
But if we start to look at the origins of Mormonism, and we start to look at Joseph Smith himself as a person, he wasn't at all comparable to someone like a Martin Luther or John Calvin. What he was heavily involved in from a very young age, with the influence of his parents and his siblings, was the occult practices of glass looking, of treasure digging. So they lived in the backwoods of upstate New York. This is during the Second Great Awakening. It's called the Burned Over District, this area where he grew up, because there's just constant revivals. So it was very low church, revival style Protestantism. But in the shadows of this same society, you have all sorts of people digging for treasure, doing seances, sacrificing animals. And so he kind of had one foot in the revivalism of that time, but then he had another foot in the occult practices of that time. In fact, he was a leader in his own right when it came to treasure digging, because from a young age, everyone thought he had a gift, and he was really good at convincing people that he could literally see treasure in the ground buried by sticking his head in a hat. And it gets really weird because he would actually like cry when he would stick his head in a hat, and he would point, different directions. You had them drawing circles, and they would actually sacrifice animals and put them in the circle. And the reason why they were doing this is they were trying to appease what they labeled as the guardians. So they saw, guardians as just like these people who have passed away. Sometimes they were Indians who had died long ago, and their ghosts were now haunting the treasure. And one really dark story that comes to mind, because some people will say, okay, that's kind of silly, but sounds pretty innocuous. Well, one story that comes to mind is when he was an older teenager. He was on a treasure dig with a whole group of guys, and he's trying to tell them where. And of course, long story short, they never find any treasure. But one of the things that he says is the reason why we're not finding any treasure, according to what the guardians are telling me in my hat as I'm looking into it, is that someone in our party needs to die in order to appease these guardians that I'm communicating with in the other realm. And eventually someone in the party actually does murder one of the other men in the party. And Joseph Smith, when he hears about this, is like, perfect, let's get back to work and let's hope we can find the treasure now. So it's pretty psychopathic.
Yeah.
As far as just being able to watch a person die because you think that's going to lead to us finding treasure. I mean, also just killing cats and dogs in front of people is pretty sick too. And so this is the world that Joseph Smith grew up in. His mother was really into, magic. His father was really into having visions, of his own. And one thing that's really interesting about Joseph Smith is that he had a serious injury and surgery on his leg, so he was bedridden for about 2 years as a child. And so this is probably the time where he started to really develop his pretty incredible imagination and creativity and come up with these stories that we, then see in the Book of Mormon. And so this was never admitted by the Mormon Church, by the way. There was a man who wrote Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview. His name was D. Michael Quinn. He was a Mormon scholar. And he was actually excommunicated for writing that book from the Mormon Church. And now the Mormon Church, many years after excommunicating him, because he published it in 1987. So they excommunicate him right when he publishes it, but now they admit all that stuff. They're, yeah, of course, Joseph Smith was a glass looker and he was using divining rods and he was drawing circles in the woods and, casting spells over certain areas so that he can find some treasure. Now they just admit it and they just kind of bite the bullet and they say, big deal. God can use whoever and whatever in order to bring about, his purposes. So this is a common pattern you're going to see when you study Mormon history is it's just a lot of gaslighting, hiding things, saying that's just ridiculous anti-Mormon nonsense. And then, years later, it just becomes overwhelming. Everyone knows about it. It hits a critical mass of awareness. And then the Mormon Church just says, you know what? Yeah, you're right. Joseph Smith did do those things, but so what? So, kind of a very quick background on what we're dealing with here. But a lot of those themes that I mentioned will actually play a role in Joseph Smith then finding the Book of Mormon, the golden plates, because an angel or a guardian lets him have those plates. And again, it's made of gold. So there's the treasure. And what does he write about? Well, he writes about Indians who died long ago. And God is going to use this book to bring them back to the gospel. And even in the Book of Mormon, it talks about treasure disappearing in the earth. And so it's just all these things he pulled from his environment. And now the Mormon Church says, well, it was an inspired, pulling from his environment. And so it just gets really messy in their apologetic because that's exactly what they claimed early Christians did. Oh, they're apostates because they pulled from the Hellenism of their environment. Well, when Joseph Smith does it, it's revelation. But when early Christians do it in the smallest way possible, it's apostasy. So it just becomes a really double standard.
Yeah. This is something that I'm currently doing research. I've actually been researching this for the past year, and I'm just finishing up an article on how Kabbalah entered early American Protestantism. And I trace it all the way back to the Renaissance. So, you had the early colonialists come over, kind of establish this new land in New England, and they founded it and called it the New Israel. So they had all of these Kabbalistic beliefs that were influenced by the Christian Kabbalists of the Renaissance and the Proto-Reformers. And you start to see it intersect with this new American religion. And there's even a book I'm going to cite from here from Harold Bloom. He has a critique of Mormonism in his book, The American Religion. And he says, what is clear is that Smith and his apostles restated what Moshe Idol, our great living scholar of Kabbalah, persuades me was the archaic or original Jewish religion. My observation certainly does find enormous validity in Smith's imaginative recapture of crucial elements evaded by normative Judaism and by the church after it. The God of Joseph Smith is a daring revival of the God of some of the Kabbalists and Gnostics, prophetic sages who, like Smith himself, asserted that they had returned to the true religion. Either there was a more direct Kabbalistic influence upon Smith that we know, or, far more likely, his genius reinvented Kabbalah in the effort necessary to restore archaic Judaism. So this is also an idea that you see in the early Puritan Congregationalists. And, you see all of these figures emerge that come through the universities. So you had all these presidents of Yale and Harvard, for example. These were conversos that introduced all of these Kabbalistic ideas into American Protestantism, and that intersects with the founding of the Mormon Church, as I'm finding in my research. I don't go into this in what I'm writing about currently, but you see a lot of that intersection. So there's Masonic ties in all of this as well. We may be familiar with the fact that Joseph Smith and Brigham Young were both Freemasons, and this is not even denied by Mormons. They will kind of, tiptoe around it by saying like, oh, well, he became a Mormon later in his life, as if that's like a rescue to that, practicing the occult. Like he founded the Mormon Church and then became a Freemason. Like, it would almost be better if he was that before he founded the church and renounced it. But as we discovered from a recent publication on Michael Hoffman's Substack, he wrote about how the official LDS account covers up the date of Joseph Smith's Masonic initiation. So it was said to be in the 1840s in Illinois on the official account, but this researcher affiliated with the church, I guess he had access to the Mormon archives, uncovered that Smith was actually initiated in the 1820s in upstate New York. So there's like a 20-year gap there. And I guess, when did he found the Mormon religion? Was that in the 1830s or something?
1830.
Yeah.
Yeah, 1830.
Yeah, so 10 years prior.
Yeah, and you'll hear a lot of just really silly claims about the origins of Mormonism. So one of the most common arguments people will make is that Joseph Smith was just this humble, quiet farm boy who was illiterate. He couldn't even read. I mean, it just gets absolutely ridiculous, because then what they do is they say, well, there's no way he could have possibly written the Book of Mormon. And Muslims make the same argument, by the way, about Muhammad. They say like, oh, the Quran is so beautiful. Muhammad could have never, written such a beautiful work. But if you look at the themes in the Book of Mormon, and you even look at like books that were written right before Joseph Smith wrote the Book of Mormon, like Ethan Smith, he wrote a book called View of the Hebrews, which is about the Native Americans and how they came from the lost tribes of Israel over to America, and how the darkened people in this book were eventually they overcame the white people in the book, and that's how we have the Indians. Like, he wrote this book before Joseph Smith wrote the Book of Mormon. And by the way, he was a minister. He was the minister, like, one town over to Oliver Cowdery, who was a cousin who later helped Joseph Smith translate the Book of Mormon. So you even have a personal connection to the man who wrote a work very similar to the Book of Mormon. So now Mormon scholars will say, okay, fine, he did pull from his environment, and he did like read a lot of things. He was really interested in geography and crypto, history type of subjects. So he made a really silly claim with the Book of Mormon, which is that all Native Americans descend from a group of Israelites who came to the Americas in 600 BC. And that was an extremely bold claim because that goes for all of North and South America and even Polynesia. Like all these people with all their ethnic diversity and linguistic diversity, they came from this small party that came over from Israel. So what the Mormon Church has done very recently in the last 15 years is they've backed off of that claim. They said that's obviously a ridiculous claim. When Columbus came, it was way too diverse of, a group of people that we found all over the North and South American continents, and a lot of Asiatic DNA and a ton of linguistic diversity. So it's a really silly claim. So now the Mormon Church says, well, the Lamanites and the Nephites, which is the people you read about in the Book of Mormon, well, they're among the ancestors of, the Indians and the Polynesians. So again, they backed off that claim because it was such a silly claim that Joseph Smith made because he didn't know anything about, DNA or history or how linguistics work. And so you just constantly see this as well as a common trend in the Mormon Church where they just keep backing off the silly claims that Joseph Smith makes. Like Joseph Smith did a translation of the Bible. He literally wrote himself into Genesis. Like he wrote that Joseph of Egypt in Genesis prophesied that there would one day come a prophet with the same name as him, and he would restore everything back to its proper place. And this is called the long ending of Genesis that Joseph Smith wrote.
Oh, the extended version.
The problem is that
the Genesis DLC
of the Bible.
Yeah.
And so the problem is that we've discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are well before there could have been any kind of corruption that the Mormon Church accuses the early Christians. They always accuse them of corrupting the Bible and taking out things from the Bible. And this would be one of the main things they would take out of the Bible, is this wonderful prophecy about Joseph Smith. Well, it's not in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There you go, case closed. He made it up. So they just keep getting caught flat-footed with these just silly claims. And by the way, his translation now, they call it an inspired commentary. If you compare it to all ancient translations, it's just the most inaccurate translation in existence. I mean, sometimes he just starts writing a whole essay based off of, John chapter 1, verse 1. So it just gets really bad when you look at the work of Joseph Smith because he's basically caught red-handed just trying to retrofit, himself into history, trying to make these crazy truth claims that later are easily debunked. And so this is the problem with Mormonism, is that it's now becoming, to your point, taking this back to Gnosticism, it's now just becoming like this, well, we don't have to take the Book of Mormon literally, and we don't have to take anything really literally. It's all just about getting close to Jesus. And it's this Christ consciousness that, they'll usually rely on when you really start to pin them down on all these truth claims. They'll just say, well, the Book of Mormon, sure, it's probably just made up, but it helps me get closer to Jesus. Yeah. Well, the problem is that this is a historical claim that the Mormons made. They claim that they are the historical church restored, and they are the chosen church with God's authority and no one else. Everyone else is the church of the devil, is what it says in the Book of Mormon. And so they've drawn some serious lines in the sand, so you just can't let them get all relativistic about, these questions. But they are becoming more ecumenist in their approach to other religions. Hey, we're all just Christian and we're all part of the same church, because they just can't really back up those claims that were made, when their church was founded.
Yeah, there's even, I remember hearing, I don't remember how long ago this was, but there was these DNA tests that revealed that the American natives were not from, it just simply revealed that they were not of Middle Eastern ancestry or of Jewish ancestry. And that just was, a big refutation of literally backed by science and DNA results that just completely debunked that whole claim, obviously. And I think it was, I don't know what the current cope is for that, but as my memory serves, it was, they basically just said oh, that was, that's their effort to slander the LDS Church or something. It's propaganda. A lot of this is just attributed to anti-Mormon propaganda. All these classic kind of instances of it being falsified.
Exactly, and they'll try to say to Christians, well, these are just archaeologists. There's also archaeologists that don't believe like the resurrection happened. So they'll try to make like a one-to-one comparison with the Christian worldview. The problem is that Mormonism makes way more bold claims than Christianity does. Like, I'll just take another example. Joseph Smith claimed to have translated what he called the Book of Abraham. And this is probably like the biggest instance of, the Mormon church having egg on their face, because when he translated it, he bought it from a traveling salesman who had a mummy. And Joseph Smith paid a lot of money to buy this mummy because with the mummy came this papyrus. And Joseph Smith claimed that when he looked at this papyrus, which was written in Egyptian, and this was before the Rosetta Stone was discovered, so no one knew how to translate Egyptian hieroglyphics. But Joseph Smith, he was a prophet, so of course he's going to do it. So he looked at it, and it's this tiny little piece of paper with it's like very few characters on it. And he says that this was written by the hand of Abraham. So if this is true, what he just claimed, this would now be the oldest piece of sacred history we would have in existence. And he has it in his hands. And he also said that Joseph of Egypt, it also included his writings as well. Why not? Just keep making bigger and bigger claims.
Yeah.
He's claiming to have the writings of Abraham by his own hand and also the writings of Joseph of Egypt, which are people who lived way before Moses, who wrote the book of Genesis. So now we're like making much bigger claims than, the Orthodox Church makes with its canon of scripture. Well, the Rosetta Stone is discovered. That piece of parchment that Joseph Smith translated is discovered. They thought it was destroyed in the Chicago fire, but lo and behold, they find it in like the 1960s. It turns up again. Now they're able to actually look at what it was Joseph Smith was translating in order to write the Book of Abraham. And they just realized it's a funerary text from like 200 AD. And it's just instructions that Egyptians would give to the departed or the dead in order to make it to the next life. So it was just like completely off. Like, he was completely wrong. And so this just happened time and time again. But the Book of Abraham is like the biggest example of where all they can do is, like you said, they can cope. They now say, well, he saw a parchment that wasn't actually the writings of Abraham, but God still inspired his mind, and he used that as a springboard for revelation. So they stop using the word translation, and they just use the word revelation. God revealed this thing about Abraham and the life of Abraham to Joseph Smith while he's looking at an Egyptian piece of parchment from, 200 AD, 2,000 years after the time of Abraham.
Wow.
Like, so now it just like no longer makes any sense.
Yeah.
And by the way, like one time, speaking of Orthodoxy, one time someone gave Joseph Smith a copy of the Greek Psalter, written in Greek, and he thought it was like, I think he said something like it was the writings of Ham, the son of Noah, or something. So, like, people kept catching him in his lies. And, there's a Kinderhook plates, which is a set of metal plates that someone made, and they used it to fool Joseph Smith. And, it was right before I believe he died, but he was like really intently working on translating that as well. And the guy who created the Kinderhook plates, he got a ton of people to, handle the plates, and those were his witnesses to their authenticity, which is what Mormons always say about the golden plates. Like, oh, people handled the golden plates and saw them, and therefore they're legitimate. So there were just so many of these moments where the whole thing should have fallen apart, but for some reason it didn't, because again, we're dealing with a time in America where people were just doing a lot of sign seeking. There was a lot of pre-lest.
Yeah.
There's a lot of everyone having mass hysteria and visions, and then signing affidavits, by the way. Like the Shakers, they all saw an angel on a roof, and they all signed affidavits that they all saw it, because they all believed in something called second sight, which is that if you see something with your spiritual eyes or your spiritual mind, it's just as literal and it's just as real as if, you and I were standing in front of each other talking. So there's also just like this magic worldview that's playing into the gullibility of a lot of these people who are joining the Mormon church early on.
Yeah, that whole revelation is, an Orthodox person will hear that and their ears should perk up to that being a sign of prelest. And I'm not even just talking about with Mormonism. It's not like we need that to know that in particular, to know that Mormonism is false. But, you see it with one example that comes to mind, and Father Seraphim Rose talks about this, in the Orthodox survival course, Francis Assisi, who has this revelation from an angel, the Archangel Michael, who permeates him with these beams of light, and he experiences the stigmata, the pain of Christ on the cross, the crucifixion wounds, and he starts bleeding. And what Father Seraphim talks about is how there was no questioning of the spirit. There was no, as we're supposed to test the spirits in these revelations, that they're not demonic. And it was just accepted as, and I don't even know that there was eyewitnesses to it. I'm not that well versed on that particular account, but, it seems kind of in the same vein. And you talk about, like with Muhammad, there's just a revelation, like it just happened. He was in a cave by himself and an angel revealed to him, and we just take his word at face value. There's always that when you see these revelation-based heresies, they're always kind of shrouded in delusion, and they start off that way, but they typically are a result of the person claiming the revelation happened being deluded. So you obviously see that there's all this occult practice that Smith is involved in, and with the treasure digging. But how much of this were you aware of while you were in the LDS Church? Did you do all these extensive studies on Smith? And, if so, if you knew about any of this stuff, what was your reasoning for it being not, I guess, questionable?
Yeah. Yeah, I would say the first thing that I started to notice was the Book of Mormon geography and claims of, the sole group of people being the ancestors of all, indigenous peoples of the Americas. I mean, that was like the first claim that someone just sat me down while I was a Mormon missionary. And he was a Mormon too, this man who sat me down. But he just said, there's no way that can be true. But he still kind of maintained his faith. He was like, look, I mean, I just think we're misinterpreting, the Book of Mormon, was like kind of his way of coping with that. And then right after he told me that, that's when the Mormon Church changed the introduction to the Book of Mormon to say something totally different, which is, they're among the ancestors of the Native Americans. So I think that was like the first time that I saw that the goalpost was being moved. I didn't really, to be perfectly transparent, I did not look deeply into things from an outsider's perspective. I would read a lot of Mormon apologetics, so I was made aware of, I remember right when I got home from my mission, so I would have been around 21 years old, I do remember reading like a BYU study on blacks in the priesthood, because that was something that came up when I was a missionary. It came up all the time, because I don't know if everybody knows this, but from the time of either Joseph Smith or Brigham Young, we're not really sure, but from early on in the Mormon Church until 1978, so easily over, 120 years plus, black people were not allowed to have the Mormon priesthood. Black men were not allowed to have the Mormon priesthood, and all black people, men and women, were not allowed to get married in the Mormon temple. They weren't allowed to get what they would call their saving ordinances, in the Mormon temple. They weren't allowed to be initiated. They weren't even allowed to set foot in the Mormon temple, long story short. And the reason is because according to Brigham Young, and he claims he got this from, Joseph Smith, that was always his excuse. Well, Joseph Smith told me this. He said that they were descendants of Cain, and they had the curse of Ham. And we don't have to go into too much detail, but basically they believe that the curse of Cain was that he would be cursed with a skin of blackness. Cain was cursed this way. And that Ham ended up marrying a descendant of Cain. And that's how that curse survived the flood during the time of Noah. And it even says in the book of Abraham, by the way, kind of bringing it back to that the descendants of Ham would always be servants to others, and that they would not have rights to the priesthood. So you have slavery now being like justified, chattel slavery, which is like a very unique kind of slavery in America, not like, historical slavery. So you have that being justified in the book of Abraham. And so this is like a real big deal, because Joseph Smith actually did have a very few, but there were some black members of the Mormon Church early on. And one of them, her name was Mama Jane, was her name, and they actually made a movie about her, during these like very PC times of Mormonism. They kind of did like
the Rosa Parks of Mormonism.
Biopic. Yeah, exactly. I couldn't have said it better myself. It was like a Rosa Parks style, like heroic tale of Mama Jane. And she was good friends with Joseph Smith and his wife Emma Smith. And so she went with the Mormons from Nauvoo, Illinois. After Joseph Smith was killed by a mob, she went with Brigham Young and the rest of the Mormons to Utah. She pleaded for like many decades for her to be able to go to the temple because she was so close with Joseph Smith, and she wanted to be eternally like bound to them through like the Mormon sealing. And so what they did as a way to accommodate her is they had Joseph F. Smith, who was like the, I think he was like the fifth prophet, and he was actually Joseph Smith's nephew. Him and his wife went into the Mormon temple. Mama Jane waited outside the temple. She still wasn't allowed in. And they sealed Mama Jane to Joseph Smith and Emma, who were, now passed away. But she was sealed to them as their eternal servant.
So,
that was the level of...
Hey friends, if you'd like to listen to the rest of this 2-hour-long discussion I had with Drew, where he reveals more of the bizarre rituals that occur in the Mormon temple, Joseph Smith's occult history, and some of the strange doctrines of Mormonism, please consider becoming a paid monthly supporter of The Reversion. You'll gain access to not just this episode, but the entire archive of my work, and our private Discord channels where we hold our weekly book club meetings, which you won't want to miss out on, because we have some exciting guests that join us. And we have weekly Russian language classes if you are interested in learning Russian. So you're getting a lot of value in return as a thank you for your support. So I hope to see you there behind the paywall. God bless.